Whoa, 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 there's more on functions that we need to cover. So let's go take 2 steps back and go back to where we introduced functions in this course. So we had seen that with a function, we could pass in an argument and pick that argument up and use it as a variable within our code. Now, we also noticed that within the function, we declared a variable called output, and we were using that variable within the function. But what happens if I take that variable and if I try, we see that output is not defined. So what's happening here? And the reason that output is not defined is because of global and local scope. So everything within the function is local scope. If there's a variable that's defined within the local scope, it's not seen outside of the function, so that's within the global scope. So you can very well have a variable called b and give it a value of 0. So you don't want to be reusing the same variables. When it comes to the local scope, so no matter how many times we click it and we see the value of b is always going to be 0, is because that's contained within the global scope. So even though I increment b by 1, b will always be equal to 1 within this local scope because we're redeclaring that variable every time we're coming in. So that's much different than accessing the variable that's sitting outside within the global scope. So this is something important to keep in mind when you are working with variables. Ones that are in the function only live within that block of code. Functions are really useful for is returning values. And let's say, for instance, we were building a type of calculator and we built out a function that was taking 2 parameters, to a plus b. And then we're going to output that value there. So now we can use that function. It's requiring 2 parameters, so 5 plus 10. So what do you think is going to happen here? What do you think we're going to get output in the console? And if you said we're outputting 15 in the console, you're correct. So we can use this formula over and over again, and it will always output that value in the console. So this isn't really ideal with functions because sometimes what you want to do is you want to do this calculation and you want to return the results. And that's what's typically done with functions. So if I have a plus b, I do return. And what's going to happen here is when I do add 4, 5, we're going to see that it returns back 9. So what that means is that if I have another variable, and going back into declaring of variables, so 40 plus 50, what do you think the value of c is going to be? So c is 90, because what we're doing is we're doing a return on the function, and essentially what's happening here is that whenever we're invoking this, we're making the calculation, and that return value is now that new calculation. And that's why we can do something like c equals add and then pass in 2 different numbers. And then now for c, we're invoking that function. That function is running, and c is now worth 150. So you can see that there's a lot of usefulness to what's happening within the code where we can do these types of calculations and output those values. So go ahead and try this out for yourself. Create several different functions and actually return back results for you within your code. And also get familiar with different local variables and global variables. So anything sitting on the root, that's going to be a global variable. So any one of the children are able to access it. Any one of the blocks of code that are into the next level are able to access it. But when you try to access stuff that's done locally within the function, you have no access to that. So keep that in mind as well.